everybody, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 Bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commander, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we make a deck that is functional, but one that is also able to pick you up the win. My name is Steph, and I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. I'm glad you can join us today as we are celebrating the 31st ever Brewing with 50 Bucks episode on the channel. Yes, I did miss the anniversary by one video. Don't at me at the comments. Nonetheless, this video actually comes as a suggestion from one of the subscribers on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed already, please make sure you do so and hit that bell icon. But Richuardo, thank you very much for the suggestion. In today's video, as you already see from the thumbnail already, we're going to be taking a look at one of Dominaria United's more popular commanders as well. So strap in as we take a look at Braids Arisen Nightmare. So Braids Arisen Nightmare is currently sitting with 589, almost 600 decks created as tallied up by EDH Trek, and also holds up as the 5th most popular commander in Dominaria United. And to be honest with you, Braids actually seems like a very fun aristocrat / sacrifice kind of commander that can take full advantage of that triggered ability at your end step. So if you guys are ready, as I'm ready, we're gonna take a look at Braids the Arisen Nightmare, starting off with the commander breakdown and the deck strategy for this deck. So, Braids Arisen Nightmare is a 3/3 for 1 black for a legendary nightmare that has the ability at the beginning of your end step. You may sacrifice an artifact, a creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So with this allows you to not only interact with your opponents, even though the ability is a May ability, but with that, you're either going to be having your opponent sacrifice stuff, or you're going to be getting some extra cards on top of it. So this kind of leads into a lot of really fun little strategies that you can go with Braids. But for the most part, the main strategy of this deck is to punish your opponents, cast Braids, and shoot for the moon in terms of wins. And as always, we build these decks with a budget of $50 in mind, which includes the price of the commander, which excludes the price of the basic lands, and we also offer a $5 overage compromise. So this deck can be built for $50 upright, but the compromise is available for those who can spare the extra $5 to build these kind of decks. The deck list for this deck will be in the show notes down below, and if I can ask of one small favor from you guys, if you like this kind of content and you want to support this channel in any way, shape, or form, don't be a stranger, like this video, share it amongst your play group, your friends, your family, whoever might like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon to be notified of any future video that comes out. And if you've done so, thank you very much. So in today's video, we're going to be going over the standard array of categories, all of the main 6 categories, which includes our sorceries, our creatures, our enchantments, our lands, our instants, and our artifacts. But fret not, if there's an important part that you want to take a look at in this video and you want to skip through it, there will be chapters in the video down below so you can mitigate through the video as you want. And with that being said, we usually like to start with the most cumbersome of categories, which in this case is going to be our creature base. So with this, we want a big creature base, as we're going to be not only mulling through a lot of just straight creatures, but we're also going to be mulling through a lot of tokens as we produce them throughout the deck. And we're going to start off strong with Bloodsoaked Champion, a 2/1 for 1 mana that can't block, but as a raid ability where for 1 and a block you can return the champion from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can only activate it if you've attacked this turn. So with Braids, you have the ability to sacrifice your creatures at any point in time, and if your opponent does not want to, you can draw those extra cards, and if they do want to, you're getting rid of a creature on the field. But with that, you can also have the ability for Bloodsoaked Champion to come back onto the battlefield after the ability goes off. So you have I believe you could stack the triggers for the Bloodsoaked Champion to come back before the cleanup step. Burglar Rat is next, and with this, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. We want to start screwing with our opponents a little bit too, and messing with their draws and messing with their heads is a great way to start, especially so with Burglar Rats being a 2-mana creature. You can just play it, get that value off the enter the battlefield ability, and then have Braids just remove it away so you can get those creatures off the field or that extra card draw. Butcher of Malakir is next. This is an absolute staple in budget black decks, where whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So with this, it basically acts as a Grave Pact or a Dictate of Erebos ability, where whenever you sacrifice a creature or whenever a creature on your side of the field dies, each opponent must sacrifice a creature. This also includes Braids, getting rid of your creatures on your end step as well. Whenever that trigger happens, you can sacrifice a creature. Each opponent first off must sacrifice a creature, and then they'll have that ability afterwards where they can sacrifice another creature. So we're going to be looking at the next couple of ones in a succinct order. We're going to be looking at Demon's Disciple, Fleshbag Marauder, Gravelighter, Plague Crafter, and Merciless Executioner, all in the same one, because they have arguably the exact same ability. For whenever each one of them comes into play, each opponent must sacrifice a creature, but it's worded differently for each one. Fleshbag Marauder and Merciless Executioner basically have just the main creature ability. Gravelighter enters the battle if you can draw a card if a creature died this turn, otherwise you sacrifice a creature. Demon's Disciple basically allows you to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and Plague Crafter allows you to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and each opponent who can't discards a card. All of these are vastly important in our deck, as they're going to get rid of creatures on our opponent's side of the field and pair it up with the Butcher of Malakir. That's going to be some extra sacrifice triggers. Giza, Glorious Resurrector is next. This is a very fun card to mess with our opponents, as whenever a creature an opponent controls would die, you can exile it instead. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put all creature cards exiled with Giza onto the battlefield under your control, and they gain Decayed. So Decayed is a very interesting ability, if I can be so forward with that. But for the fact that you can sacrifice your opponent's creatures and you exile them, which is vastly important, especially if you're dealing with a combo deck, if you're dealing with big creatures, stomping, anything like that, or Voltron helps the most, especially with sacrifice on our side of the field, as whenever you get the chance to do so, as long as they're not their commanders, you can exile them and you can play them, you can have them come onto your battlefield at the beginning of your upkeep on the next upkeep. Great Merchant of Asphodel is next. Gary is one of our signature cards. It's one of our game enders, as for 5 mana, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. It's reasonable to say Gary actually does a lot in this deck, especially so. Braids already has 2 devotion to it, as each one of the black mana symbols is there, and for each permanent you have with a black mana symbol on there, Gary just gets more lethal, and you can not only are you going to be potentially scouring your opponents of life, you're also getting the life back from the life loss total. Grim Haruspex is next. Whenever another non-token creature you control would die, you draw a card. Easy enough, especially when we have our Demon's Disciple, when we have our Fleshbag Marauders, anything like that. Whenever we're sacrificing a non-token creature, we're getting some extra card draw on top of it. Jadar Ghoulcaller of Nephalia is next. This is another interesting one where if you, at the beginning of your end step, if you control no creature with Decayed, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. So with this, we're going to be getting some extra bodies on the field. As I mentioned earlier, tokens is a good part of our deck, as they are going to be helping us get some more bigger bodies on the field. They're going to help us get some shields up, especially so with us targeting our opponents and just making them sacrifice everything. We do want to have a little bit of defense. So Jadar does help us get an extra token on the battlefield. Lorcan Warlock Collector is next. This is a very interesting card as well, where whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you can pay life equal to its mana value, and if you do, you put it on the battlefield under your control. It's a Warlock in addition to its other types, and if a Warlock you control would die, you exile it instead. So, with Lorcan, it's very similar to Giza, where whenever a creature your opponent controls dies, you exile it. But with Lorcan, you can actually just pay the life and put it on your side of the battlefield, depending on how expensive the mana curve is for you and the mana value in terms of your life as well. But for the most part, you can be getting some big stuff. You can be getting some important stuff that your opponents kill off. It's going to be a really fun card to add into this. And especially having a 6/6 flyer on your side of the field helps a lot too, with some big damage. Massacre Girl is next. This is one of our board wipes in this deck, where for 5 mana, when a Massacre Girl enters the battlefield, each other creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is probably one of the ultimate board wipes, where it gets around creatures that have indestructible, where with normal board wipes, there's you have to destroy all creatures, where if you're indestructible, it doesn't affect them. But with Massacre Girl, she deals with -1/-1 counters. So each creature that has indestructible, they're just going to be mitigating their toughness. So when their toughness hits 0, especially with Massacre Girl, their indestructibility means nothing, and as they'll die because they'll have no toughness. And for each one of them, each creature that dies, it's stacking on the extra -1/-1 for that turn. So Massacre Girl can pull a lot of weight in terms of getting rid of creatures. Midnight Reaper is next, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, it deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. Easy enough where, like I mentioned before with the Grim Horror specs, you're going to be having creatures die all the time, and what's one extra card and 1 extra life for you? It's just extra value on your side of the field. Noxious Gearhulk is next. When it enters the battlefield, you can destroy another target creature, and if the creature was destroyed this way, you gain life equal to its toughness. So, great card, as you can just straight up just murder an opponent's creature, and especially so, you're getting life on top of it. So for 6 mana, be having a 5/4 menace with an enter the battlefield ability, it's pretty on the nose, and you can be getting some life back on it. So win-win. Next two are Persistent Specimen and Reassembling Skeleton. So the reason I'm adding both of these onto the field is that not only does it trigger Braids, but you can return them onto the battlefield as well. And this will also trigger the Midnight Reaper, this will trigger Giza. This can trigger a lot of things coming and leaving the battlefield too. And especially to pair it up with a Butcher, as I mentioned before, whenever it dies, your opponents are going to be made to sacrifice a creature, and you can just bring back either the Specimen or the Skeleton itself. Ravenous Chupacabra is next. 4 mana for a creature to enter the battlefield and destroy target creature an opponent controls. Very, very straight up stuff, and for it being a low costed creature, it's pretty good, as with an enter the battlefield, you destroy a creature, having Braids on the field, you can just get rid of it immediately and have your opponents sacrifice a creature or make you draw an extra card. Shambling Gas is next, a 1 mana zombie where when it dies, you can either have target creature and opponent control get -1/-1 till end of turn, or just create a treasure token. So you can either kill off one of their weenies, or you can get some extra mana on your side of the field. Solemn Simulacrum is next. Having a creature with both an ETB and LTB ability is very, very good in this case. So having Solemn on the field, you can just have it enter the battlefield, get your land onto the battlefield, your basic land on the battlefield, and shuffle. And then when Sad Robot dies, you draw a card. So you can have it come into play and then same turn sacrifice it to Braids and get that extra card draw on top of it. Next one up is Tergrid, God of Fright. This is probably going to be the MVP of this deck, where this is arguably the better version of Braids, depending on who you want to ask. And if you feel so, let me know in the comments down below. But with this, whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you can put that card onto the battlefield under your control. And then it can also have a flip over to the Lantern, where you can have target player lose 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card, and then 3 and a black to untap the Lantern, but we're going to be mostly playing it for the creature itself, as Tergrid is the ultimate sacrifice, discard, whatever you want to call it, mono black commander, and it is a ruthless deck. Especially so. Having both Braids and Tergrid on the field is just an absolute nightmare to deal with. Undercity Scrounger is next. 3 mana for a human rogue that allows you to tap it to create a treasure token, and you can only activate it only if a creature died this turn. So I believe, as well as I mentioned with the Bloodsoaked champion, you can stack the triggers to have Braids kill a creature off, and then you can create a treasure token. Let me know if that works in the comments down below, but having a creature make treasure tokens, despite the small limitation, is significant. Especially so, you're getting some extra mana on top of it. And then lastly, Virus Beetle rounds off our list for creatures, where for 2 mana, it enters the battlefield and each opponent discards a card. Going into our next category, we're going to be looking at our artifacts. So with our artifacts, we also have a lot of fun little interactions with our artifacts, and we want to do some fun stuff along the lines too. Not only just ramp, but we also want some protection, we want some fun stuff, and we want some good interaction with our commander. Starting off with Chromatic Star. So with this, it's a 1 mana artifact with 1 mana, and tap and sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color. When it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. So arguably speaking, this always looks like a terrible card to add in any deck when you really think about it. But with Braids on the field, you can still use the chromatic star to just sacrifice it and have your opponent sacrifice an artifact instead. For any other deck, it would be absolutely terrible. For this one, it's passable. Crowded Crypt is next. 3 mana for an artifact that allows you to add 1 black mana. Whenever a creature you control dies, you put a corpse counter on it, and then for 4 black and sacrifice it, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature with Decayed on it for each corpse counter on the crypt. Seeing as we have a lot of sacrifice creatures or kill off creatures in our creature base, Crowded Crypt is going to be fantastic for us, as we can just keep adding black mana, we can keep adding those corpse counters on top of it, and if it's about to die or if somebody's about to get rid of it, we can just activate it for the last cost and make some black zombies with Decayed on your side, just as an extra set of blockers or attackers, depending on how you want to look at it. Cursed Totem is next. I'm adding a little bit of stacks in this deck. Having Cursed Totem with activated abilities of creatures can't be activated does hinder a lot of decks, and especially so if you need it in that moment, you can always whisk it away with Braids. But having at least 1 or 2 stacks cards in your deck doesn't hurt your deck at all, as instead it would actually help you out, as you can slow down the game and you kind of bend it to your own whim, so to speak. Decanter of Endless Waters is next. I am surprised this card is not super out of budget yet, where for 3 mana, it's an artifact that allows you to tap for 1 mana of any color, but you have no maximum hand size. I think this is a really fantastic card. It's starting to creep a little bit in price, but it's actually pretty sustainable and on budget, and I'm pretty sure it's not going to just over-flounder in terms of the price. Guardian Idol is next. This one enters the battlefield tapped, adds a colorless mana, but for 2, it becomes a 2/2 golem artifact until end of turn. So with this, you have the choice with Braids. You can actually sacrifice it as a creature, or you can sacrifice it as an artifact, depending on how you see it, and you can have your opponents just completely just sacrifice the creatures, or you get some extra card draw on top of it. Ichor Wellspring is next. 2 mana for when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you can just draw a card. So with this, play it, get a card draw. With Braids, you can activate it to sacrifice it, you get an extra draw, and then you can either get a draw or have your opponent sacrifice an artifact instead. Liquid Metal Torque is next. 2 mana to add a colorless mana, or you can tap it also to tap target non-land permanent become an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. Considering the fact we don't run a lot of artifact removal in black, we can rely on our opponents, or secretly rely on our opponents if they're in red or if they're in green, whatever really deals with artifacts. You can just have them turn an opponent's non-land permanent into an artifact, and then they can just easily kill it and get rid of it. Mycosynth Wellspring is next. This is very much in relation to the Ichor Wellspring, where when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you can search your library for a basic land and put it into the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. And as I mentioned before, without sounding like a broken record, you could play this, fetch your land, and then on the same turn you can just Braids it away to get an extra land drop. Nimble Right's Chromatic is next. Again, same thing. I'm not going to sound like a broken record, but when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token. Prize Statue is next, same deal, but in this case, when it leaves or enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token. Soul Ring is next, standard card in any EDH deck. 1 mana to tap it to add 2 colorless mana. Spine of Ishsaw is next, 7 mana where it enters the battlefield, you can destroy target permanent, and when it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you return the spine back to its owner's hand. This is probably another MVP card in this deck. For 7, it is costly, it's 7 mana, but you destroy permanents with this, and I think this is our only real permanent removal card in this deck. And you can just sacrifice it away. You can sacrifice it away with Braids and just get it back to your hand, which is value on top of value. Swiftfoot Boost is next, allowing us to protect and give haste to Braids if we ever see fit. And lastly, Ugin's Nexus is next. I decided to add this in just for lulz, but for the fact if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead, and if Ugin's Nexus would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it and take an extra turn after this one. We can easily just sacrifice it with Braids, but we can also just do this to have our opponents skip their turn instead, which I think is kind of funny too. Our next category is our sorceries. This is actually the first time in a little while where a deck actually has more sorceries than instants in this case, where in this case, we don't rely too much on instant speed interaction. Instead, we do more stuff on our turn. So it is kind of justifiable having some a list in this case with a little bit more slower paced action instead of fast paced action. Starting off our list with Army of the Damned, 8 mana. I think this is probably the most costly spell in our list, where for 8 mana you get to create 13 tap 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with flashback for 10. So you can easily just whittle this away, and then at a later time you can just flash it back for 10 mana to get 13 black zombie creatures onto your side of the field, or you play it for 8 and you get those 13 no matter what. Awaken the Erstwhile is next. 5 mana for a sorcery that each player discards all the cards in their hand and then creates that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. This is just a really funny card, as this screws over everybody with card draw. They dip their hands and then they create zombies instead of having cards in their hand. I like this a lot, as this will mostly prompt a counter spell, but this also does prompt our opponents just not being able to deal with it and just losing their entire hand. Diabolic Tutor is next. I'm not going to go too in depth with this because this is one of the main cards we add in any black deck. 4 mana to search your library for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Feed the Swarm is next, where for 2 mana you can destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and you lose life equal to the permanent's mana value. Frame Omnipotence is next. 5 mana for each player losing half their life, then discarding half the cards in their hand, then sacrificing half the creatures they control, rounded up each time. Again, we want some chaos, we want some stacks in this deck. I'm adding a little mix of everything in this deck, as I really feel like Braids is kind of it is not the original Braids, obviously, but this one does lend itself a little bit to some chaos in a sense. Head Games is next. This is probably my new favorite black sorceries. 5 mana for the sorcery where target opponent puts their cards from their hand on top of his or her library. You search that player's library for that many cards, and then that player puts those cards into their hand and then shuffles a library. So if somebody already tutored for a win, you can literally just play Head Games, make them put it back into your library, and then just give them just basic lands. This is just absolute lunacy, absolute chaos, and I absolutely love this card. Mastermind's Acquisition is next. Another 4 mana card, but with this one you get to search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library, or you choose a card you own from outside the game and put it into your hand. You're most likely going to be able to get away with the first ability, whereas the second ability is not always going to be accepted. But mainly this is just used as a quick tutor to get something to really help you out in that sense. Mutilate is next. 4 mana for all creatures getting -1/-1 till end of turn. For each swamp you control. We are running a lot of swamps in this deck, so it's not going to be a problem for Mutilate. Siphon Mine will allow each other player to discard a card from their hand. You draw a card for each card that they discard this way. And the last card of our sorceries is Unearth, where you can return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it also has cycling 2. We're coming down to the last 3 categories in our deck. We're going to start off with our enchantments. So with our enchantments, we also, like I mentioned before, with our artifacts, we have some interaction with this. But within our enchantments, we're running a little less than 10. But with some of these, you might be surprised as to where this goes. Starting off our list with Agent of the Iron Throne. It's one of the legendary backgrounds that we started seeing in Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate, where for 3 mana, commander creatures you control have one of an artifact, or a creature you control is put into your graveyard from the battlefield. Each opponent loses 1 life. This is great with Braids, as we have a number of creatures and a number of artifacts that we can just get rid of with Braids, and each one of them will mitigate each opponent for 1 life. Blight Mound is next, and whenever non-token creature you control dies, you create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token. With whenever this creature dies, you gain a life, and attacking pests you control get +1/+0 and have menace. Basically some extra fodder for us to sacrifice with Braids as well, and for the most part we're getting some bodies on our side of the field. Bottomless Pit is next. During each player's upkeep, that player discards a card at random from their hand. And like I mentioned before, we're adding a bit of chaos, we're adding a bit of stacks. We want some stuff to really make our opponents mad. Cultist of the Absolute is next. A 1 mana background where commander creatures you own get +3/+3 and have flying, death touch, ward. You pay 3 life. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice a creature. Considering the amount of tokens and creatures that we have on our side of the field, the upkeep cost will not be a problem, but the extra +3/+3, flying, death touch, and protection will go a long way with Braids, giving it a lot of heft to it and being able to kill our opponents that much quicker. Desolation is next, another stacks card, but for 3 mana instead. At the beginning of each turn, each player who tapped a land for mana during that turn has to sacrifice a land. If a plains is guarded this way, Desolation deals 2 damage to that plains' controller. So basically, any person who tries to tap lands for mana will have to sacrifice a land at the end step. Dreadhorde Invasion is next, and with this, at the beginning of upkeep, you lose a life in a mass 1, where you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a zombie army, or you create a zombie army creature token and then put the +1/+1. And whenever it's a zombie token you control get with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. We're not going to be worrying about the last part of that. We're just using it for the amass trigger to get us a zombie on our side of the field. Greed allows us to pay a life to get some extra card draw, but for the cost of 1 extra mana and for 2 life, but this is great as we get to siphon through our deck that much quicker. Necrosynthesis is next, 2 mana for an aura where enchanted creature has, when another creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and then when enchanted creature dies, look at the top X cards of your library. X is the power. Put one of those cards onto your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So with this, we get to bump up Braids as big as we want with all the sacrificing that's going on, and especially so when it dies, we get to look at the top X cards and put a card into our hand from there. So it's kind of value on top of value. Last of our enchantments rounding it off is Warlock class, a 1 mana enchantment that has initially at the beginning of your end step. If a creature died this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. You can level it up to level 2, where when it becomes level 2, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, you put 1 of them onto your hand, the rest into your graveyard, and then for 7 mana at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the life they've lost this turn. Our instance is our penultimate category in this list. We're only running 7 instants in this deck, but for this, we want to use it in the basic way that we can in black. Starting with Defile, where for 1 mana, target creature gets -1/-1 till end turn for each swamp you control. Basically, like I mentioned before, with the Massacre Girl trigger, this gets around indestructible, as easily get rid of a creature almost immediately. Force of Despair is next. If it's not your turn, you can exile a black card from your hand rather than paying the spell's mana cost, but you can destroy all creatures that enter the battlefield this turn. This is especially lethal to token decks and go wide decks, where whenever a player is going wide and expecting to go super wide with tokens or with a lot of weenies, before they end their turn, you could Force of Despair and destroy all their creatures and set them back an entire turn, if not even more. Hellish Rebuke is next, and until end of turn, permanents your opponent's control gain 1 this permanent damage to the player that casts Hellish Rebuke. Sacrifice this permanent, you lose 2 life. This is especially perfect as this just completely screws over an opponent who wants to kill you out of the gate. Especially if it's a go wide strategy, this is even worse for them, as if they're going wide with tokens and they kill you outright, you just play Hellish Rebuke and you can probably kill them in revenge too. Hero's Downfall destroys a creature or a planeswalker. Infernal Grasp destroys just a creature, but at the cost of 2 life. Soul Shatter allows each opponent to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control for 3 mana. And lastly, Zat's Will allows us to choose either 1, or if we control Braids, we can choose 2. So each opponent sacrifices a creature they control the greatest power, and or exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards and then create X 0/1 black thrall creature tokens, where X is the greatest power among creature cards. So with this, we can absolutely have our opponent sacrifice a creature with the greatest power, which is no problem at all. And then if we control Braids, we can easily just exile all cards, or we just exile all cards and create some thralls in that case. Our last category is our lands. As I always mention, this is the fuel that drives our engine, what we need to get this deck up and running, and I've made this extremely simple. 35 swamps. Yes, I'm not pulling any, I am being absolutely serious. No fetches, no nothing, just straight up swamps for this deck. And that's how you build a Nightmare of Commander. I don't have any funny puns this week, actually. Anyways, that being said, with our deck budget of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic clans, we're looking at a deck total today of $53.88, which technically puts us over the budget, but under budget with the $5 overage compromise. So with this, as you've seen just before, I created an entire deck for you guys to put together, and this is just a good template or starting point for those who want to build Braid, the Arisen Nightmare. So with that, you can take this deck however many ways you want to, whether you want to go more sacrifice route, more aristocrats route, more Cheerios if you want even. With that, we have our last section to go, and it's with the pros and cons and the out-of-budget suggestions for the deck. Let's get started with the pros and cons. Starting with our pros, this is actually a very fun deck to mix up playing styles. As if you're known for playing a very succinct style, this deck is actually really good in playing it off. As even though there is only 100 cards in this deck, this has a different feel than most other decks. As you're basically playing the long game with this deck, having to create a lot of creatures, destroy the creatures, sacrifice stuff, and then you can just play stuff like Frayed Opponents, Head Games, Desolation, anything like that, just to throw your opponents a giant curveball. And it's a very fun punishment deck. I label it as a punishment deck only for the fact that this is just I don't remember the actual term for this deck, this kind of deck. It's not exactly a stacks deck, and it's not exactly a chaos deck either. I just call it punishment as there's like a good solid mix of everything here, where you're making your opponent sacrifice stuff, they're losing life, you get to play with their hands, you get to play with their fields, everything in between. And this is a really fun deck to level the play field a little bit too, where you have Braids on the field that allows you to sacrifice creatures and artifacts, and a lot of our artifacts allow us to get some extra value on top of it. Even some of our creatures give us some value on top of it too. But for the most part, this is just an absolute fun deck to try out. And ultimately speaking, it's a very fun deck to play with your friends if you're not having a very fun night. Some of the cons of this deck are very glaring. The most important one is that there's no definite win con. I would say at the very most, Gary or Grey Merchant of Asphodel is our main win con in this deck, where it's the amount of lost life and the life gain to it. But for the most part, you're not going to be relying on like a combo. You're not relying on big damage. You're not really relying on commander damage either. You're just playing the long game and trying to whittle yourself down to make it a one-on-one in this case, where when you go one-on-one, you probably have a better chance of winning in that case. Your board presence also could be very lacking, especially when you have a deck that's mainly just sacrificing artifacts, enchantments, creatures, whatnot. Basically, you might not even draw into the cards that give you tokens. You might not even get a chance to draw into those. So you could have a very stale and stagnant board presence. And lastly, I mentioned it before in the creature section, but Turgid would fit this role much better than Braids. Ultimately speaking, that is a truth, and I personally believe that too. Turgid would be the ultimate caveat for this deck. But in the case of Braids, the challenge was to make a Braids or Arisen Nightmare deck, and with it, it's still a very fun deck. And I'm not trying to sound like a broken record here, but it's ultimately a very cute and kind of like super interactive deck, especially. So it's kind of it's weird in play testing, but that's kind of what you get with the pros and cons, especially with a template like this, you get to mingle and mix and match different cards. Our last category we're getting into in this video is our out-of-budget suggestions. As you saw, we made this deck with a budget of $50 and including the overage compromise. But if you want to spice this deck up a little bit and go beyond the little curve of $50, I have 4 suggestions that might pique your interest a little bit here. Starting off with Black Market Connections. With Black Market Connections, at your pre-combat main phase, you can either create a treasure token, draw a card and lose 2 life, or you can create a 3/2 colorless shapeshifter creature with changeling and you lose 3 life. So you're getting some mana, you're drawing cards, or you're creating another dude. And with this, it's great because you get some extra card draw, or you can get some extra mana, or if you need an extra body, you have that ability to do so as well. And especially so, Braids is always there to get rid of that shapeshifter whenever needed, but at the cost of 3 life each time you have to pay for the shapeshifter. I would say this is a great card, especially for it being 3 mana, although it is $33 currently speaking. It is still a great card to add in this kind of deck as well. Next card I would openly suggest you put in this deck would definitely be be Grave Pact. And this is not just limited to Grave Pact. This also extends itself to Dictate of Erebos as well, and any other card that meets the same requirement like it too. But Grave Pact is the same thing as another Butcher of Malakir, but at significantly cheaper cost than 7 mana, where basically you can do it, you can just play it as the enchantment, you have some extra mana to just sacrifice some stuff, and then you can go nuts with the Braids. And if you stack it with Grave Pact, Dictate, and with the Butcher, you're gonna be wiping an entire field, ultimately speaking. Oppression is the third rest suggestion I would add in this deck. And I kind of like Oppression in this case, where each player, whenever a player casts a spell, they have to discard a card from his or her hand. It's some extra jank, it's some extra stacksy fun, but this does slow down the game a lot, and this does put the game kind of in your favor a little bit here, especially if you set yourself up in a great way to not be able to play cards, but just create tokens all the time. You're going to be in a good spot, especially with Oppression on the field. The last suggestion I would add in this deck would definitely be Kokusho the Evening Star. For the sole purpose of whenever it dies, each opponent loses 5 life and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Especially so, and if you change this deck to make it more like a Reanimator deck or something of where you're adding a lot of like Animate Dead or Reanimate cards, having Kokusho come back each and every time will just spell the end for your opponents. As each time Kokusho dies, it's an extra 5 life lost for your opponents. You gain the life back, and you just rinse and repeat until your opponents are long gone. And I'm gonna leave it off there today, guys. What do you guys think of this deck list for Braid Arisen Nightmare? Do you guys agree with me, or are there any suggestions you guys want to add to this deck list? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you like this kind of content and you want to support the channel in any way, shape, or form, be my guest. Please like the video, share it amongst your friends or play group, whoever likes this kind of content that you know. Subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, hit that bell icon, because not only would I appreciate it, but it will help the channel grow and get more eyes on the channel and spread it to more people who like this kind of content like yourselves. And you can also follow my social medias. They'll be in the bottom left-hand side of your screen, along with the links in the show notes down below. So feel free to add me through there. And if you have any suggestions for any new videos, whether it be a new Brewing for 50 bucks episode, discussion video, gameplay video, anything of the sort, let me know there, and I'll be more than happy to accommodate to you guys. One last little thing before I let you go. Mostly I post every week. Last week was a little different as I caught COVID, if you haven't seen the short that I posted last week. And that kind of left me in a bit of a rut, and I didn't want to just give you subpar content. With that, I post every week, and starting next week actually is going to be very, very fun, because October is just around the corner. Tomorrow is October 1st, which means my absolute favorite month of the year is upon us. And with that, I'm planning some big stuff this next month, including 2 Horror Brew videos. If you haven't seen what a Horror Brew video is, there's gonna be a link up top to my very first Horror Brew video for Freddy Krueger. And with that, you'll get some good inspiration for what's to come in this next month. But with that, guys, I'm gonna leave it off there. Thank you so much for coming through and watching all the way to the end. I truly appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next Friday for the very first video of October. Until next week, guys, cheers, everybody.